Imagine a medieval military force so massive it literally shook the foundations of Europe. At its peak, that's exactly what we're talking about. But how did this towering giant of an army completely collapse, only to be resurrected from the ashes by a 17-year-old peasant girl? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to explore the true size and, honestly, the incredible evolution of the French army during the Hundred Years' War. Let's get right into it. 20,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. Early on in the 14th century, 20,000 represented the total fighting men in the assembled French host. I really want you to picture the sheer scale of that. We're talking thousands of lances, banners flying everywhere, and horses just thundering across the countryside. It was this massive, terrifying wall of steel in an era way before modern centralized militaries even existed.
Chapter 1. The Early French Host.
So, to understand how this military giant actually operated before everything fell apart, we've got to look at its composition. The real heavy hitters here were the 8,000 mounted men-at-arms. These guys were incredibly expensive, highly equipped noble knights, literally the absolute elite of medieval warfare. And backing them up, you have 5,000 crossbowmen, whose piercing bolts were absolutely essential for taking down heavy armor, plus another 5,000 assorted militia and infantrymen. It was a formidable, highly specialized force.
But it begs the question, right? How do you actually assemble a force like that without a modern government? Well, you use the banner system. The king would call upon his vassals, who would then call upon their vassals, all the way down to the local militias. And these men would gather under the literal, physical banners of their lords. It created these massive kind of ad hoc fighting groups that were organized entirely around feudal loyalty and, frankly, immense wealth.
Chapter 2. The War for the Crown.
So what geopolitical spark ignited the powder keg that dragged this massive army into a grueling century-long meat grinder? Actually, it all came down to a legal dispute. In 1328, the French king died without a male heir. Now, French law strictly prohibited passing the crown through a female line, so they picked a French cousin, Philip. English law, however, fully allowed matrilineal succession, and that meant the English king, Edward III, whose mother was a French princess, claimed the throne for himself. So you have these two completely conflicting legal viewpoints that directly triggered the devastating Hundred Years' War in 1337. What followed were decades of back-and-forth attritional warfare. Sweeping chronological phases of bloodshed basically defined the era. But everything changed in 1415. The Battle of Agincourt was just a catastrophic, completely devastating defeat for the French at the hands of the English King Henry V. It led to the French Dauphin, the heir to the throne, being entirely delegitimized. The traditional French military was, for all intents and purposes, completely shattered.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, An Army in Ruins.
Decades of catastrophic battlefield losses left the traditional French host utterly destroyed. But the enemy wasn't the only thing decimating their ranks. 5 million. Yeah, take a moment to really let that sink in. 5 million is the number of souls lost in France, not to English arrows, but to the Black Death. The entire manpower pool and the tax base required to fund those elite noble knights was basically wiped off the map. The French were on the absolute brink of total defeat.
Now, here's what's really interesting. This sheer devastation literally forced military innovation. Because the old noble vassals were gone, the new army had to adapt. They started relying heavily on middle-class soldiers who could actually fund their own gear, as well as hardened mercenaries. Technologically, we see the widespread adoption of heavy plate armor, thanks to new blast furnaces and the terrifying introduction of early gunpowder siege artillery. So it was an ad hoc but rapidly evolving war machine.
And that sets the stage perfectly for Chapter 4, The Maiden's Arrival. Even with all these new innovations, by 1428 the French forces were completely demoralized and besieged at the vital city of Orléans. But then, an unbelievable savior emerged, Joan of Arc. And the crazy thing is, she wasn't a noble, she wasn't a knight, she was a 17-year-old peasant girl from a farming family with zero military background whatsoever. Driven purely by divine conviction, she claimed to hear the voices of saints since she was 13. She actually convinced local townsfolk to escort her on an incredibly dangerous 11-day journey through hostile English-controlled territory just to reach the desperate Dauphin. And against all odds, it worked. She passed church examinations, famously picked the Dauphin out of a crowded room, and proved her devotion. Desperate for a literal miracle, the future king equipped her for war. He commissioned a custom suit of plate armor specifically for her, gave her 5 war horses, let her design a personal banner, and she was even armed with an ancient sword miraculously discovered behind a church altar. I mean, you really can't write this stuff. All right, let's get into Chapter 5, the Siege of Orleans.
Fully equipped and overflowing with holy zeal, Joan set her sights on the pivotal bottleneck of the entire war in 1429. Here's the setup. You have 5,000 heavily entrenched English troops choking off the city. Inside, there are 4,000 French defenders whose morale is dangerously low. They're practically on the verge of surrendering. And entering this total nightmare is Joan, attached to a tiny supply relief force of maybe 500 men. On paper, it's a complete suicide mission. But miraculously, Joan slipped right past the blockade and entered the city.
Instantly, she electrified those defenders. She didn't want to sit around and wait. She wanted to attack, launching a rapid, highly aggressive counteroffensive. First, she inspired the French to charge out and capture the eastern fort of St. Lou. Then, leveraging the surging morale of the city's militias, they swarmed across the river on makeshift rafts to seize the outer boulevards. Finally, they set up for a massive, heavy assault on the ultimate English stronghold, the fortified bridgehead of Les Tourelles.
But, leading from the front comes with a terrifying cost. Joan was gravely wounded. She stepped on an iron spike trap, and during that brutal assault on Les Tourelles, an English arrow slipped right through the joints of her plate armor, driving deeply between her neck and shoulder. Now, these are excruciating injuries that would completely sideline any hardened veteran. But Joan, she simply pulled back, prayed, and immediately went right back to the front lines.
Her reappearance on the battlefield was honestly cinematic. Seeing their wounded maiden return to those blood-soaked walls, the French troops just entered an absolute frenzy. Joan charged forward, her banner striking the fortress battlements, and she screamed this powerful rallying cry, "All is yours, go in!" And the French swarmed those walls with unparalleled, unstoppable intensity.
The English were completely overrun. As they desperately tried to retreat, the bridge actually collapsed beneath them, killing their commander. The stronghold fell. Tactically speaking, the English were broken. Just days later, on May 8th, they packed up their camps and fled. After 210 grueling days, the siege of Orleans was broken. The entire momentum of the 100 Years' War had violently, completely shifted.
Finally, Chapter 6, A Miraculous Legacy.
The immediate aftermath of Orleans sent shockwaves across medieval Europe. The reality of what just happened quickly began to blur with some really explosive mythos. Contemporary knights started writing that Joan wasn't just a brave girl, but a literal divine entity. They claimed she was born on the holy feast of the Epiphany, and that roosters crowed joyfully for 2 full hours to herald her arrival. Now, sure, these layers of legendary embellishment were pretty normal for medieval visionaries, but they served a very real, very practical military purpose. They swelled the ranks of her holy army with thousands of zealous new recruits.
Which leaves us with this massive question. Joan of Arc had broken the impossible siege of Orleans, starting with just a handful of troops. But with the myth of the maiden now echoing across the entire continent, could this 17-year-old visionary truly command tens of thousands of men and push all the way to reclaim the very gates of Paris? Well, that is a strategic evolution you definitely won't want to miss. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history you think you know.